So tonight we're talking about Plato's Republic, exploring Plato's Republic. And one of the cautions that I always make is that, like I say, my background is in history, and so that whenever I kind of approach philosophy, it's usually through the lens of a historian or historian of philosophy, and so therefore it becomes a little bit of a second language to me as now you get older and your brain is less malleable and less able to cram all these things in, but I will do my best, and I appreciate all of your comments and as we kind of go forward with this together. So the Republic is among, Plato, who's the author, is among the most influential thinkers in history. The Republic is among his best work known today. It hasn't always been the most work that he's most famous for, but now it is. It was published, in the 4th century BC, and I think it continues to present ideas that are part of our conversation now and continue to be challenging, at the very least are foundational for how we view some of our most important questions about meaning today. And I find that actually in the reviewing for this lecture and rereading it, it's sort of amazing how many very famous things are crammed into this one document, this one dialogue. It's the kind of thing like that happens when you go back to Shakespeare and you realize that every single thing, every line that he's ever said is either a title of a movie or a title of a song, because all these all become our quotable quotes. So one of the most famous things that is found in the Republic is Plato's famous Allegory of the Cave. And so we've actually before had an entire lecture that was devoted to this, but it comes up all the time whenever anybody's talking about philosophy. And so if you just briefly will mention, the idea of it here is, the allegory is that people in life are like prisoners that are chained in a cave. They're looking essentially at a wall where they're watching a shadow show of shadow puppets, and because of their binding, and they can't actually look around and actually see with a light where that's even coming from. The light itself is only coming from a candle, and the reflection is, they're only getting the sense of activity, but that's all they know. In other words, that's all of the physical reality that they have access to, is this shadowy world of shadow puppets. Now, what if one of them were freed and they saw that, and moreover, they even ascended out of that cave into, what we understand to be the real world, and see the actual sun? On the one hand, how painful it would have to be to their eyes to try to even adjust to it, how painful it would be to realize that everything that they'd known had been this just illusion when they see actual reality, and then how much they therefore might want to go back and tell the fellow prisoners about what the true reality is, and how unlikely those guys would want to even listen to that. And so that's essentially like a kind of an analogy of the philosopher who has now looked beyond what Plato believed in the material world, which is functionally just as unreal as shadows, and in fact there is a real world of ideas that we maybe can think of analogously, like things like mathematics, which, in other words, the Earth is not a perfect sphere, or even it's not even attempting to be a perfect sphere, but there is mathematically the idea of a perfect sphere that can be described in math, but can't exist in reality, right? And so that perfect world of thought, the intelligible world, is the real world of the ideas, as Plato's argument. So it's essentially flipping that on end about what almost anybody thinks generally, and especially in modern times, where we have all sort of become materialists, where the only thing that matters is matter, and that ideas are immaterial often in our present modern philosophy. Okay, that's just one of the things, the cave. What else is in the Republic? Another one of these things that's maybe a little less famous in terms of the story, or the analogy of the divided line, but what comes out of that is a description of Plato's theory of the forms, or the universal ideas. And I put on here all the different Platonic solids, because Plato likes those. Again, we were talking about that math, but also I put on here like just the image of the form of the chair, because for whatever reason people always use the chair as the example of every chair that we have, that all these chairs that you're sitting in, are just physical manifestations of chair, each of which is imperfect, as opposed to the real, true form of a chair, that exists in the ideal realm that Plato thinks is the most important realm. So whereas all these little physical chairs that you have are just temporary, imperfect versions of chair, which will ultimately, presumably make it their way to a recycling bin or whatever's going to happen to them someday in the future. They're pretty new right now, but eventually they won't be. So anyway, the idea of the forms, right? The metaphor of the sun. So the idea that just as there is this thing in the physical universe that provides all of the light and warmth for our cosmos, our solar system, in that same exact way, then in this universe, as far as Plato is concerned, this universe of the forms, there is one ultimate form. There's one prime oneness that is at the center of everything, that is both the cause of everything else and that everything else in that way is dependent on, in the same way the sun, and that form for Plato is the good, or good for goodness sake, that kind of thing. And so this analogy of the forms. Want to have a comment? No, you're just holding the microphone. Okay. The idea of the philosopher king. You probably have heard of philosopher kings. So, yeah. They got one in the U.S. now, apparently. No, wait, no, that's not it. Wait, that's not the idea. The metaphor of the ship of state. You might have heard this. I just Googled it and I found a couple, just in present-day news of, United States and Britain's, analogy is that the state is a ship, the leader is the pilot of the ship, and this kind of a thing, and it's contemporary cartoons. So the idea of the ship of state is still present with us. From the Republic again. The noble lie. The idea that there could be a good end to a pious fraud. And I have here a picture of the ark. And so one of the pious frauds that we've talked about in previous lectures, and actually we're going to talk about when we're talking about who wrote the Old Testament, is at some point or other we have in the book of Kings, it's recorded that the scribes went into the area where the ark is kept in the temple, and they found a scroll of the law that nobody had ever seen before. And when they read it, it contained scripture that nobody had ever heard before. And when the king read it all and realized all the things and all the laws that they hadn't been doing, he rent his garments and was in mourning. King Hezekiah, I think. And so when that all happened, that became the basis for the monolatrous reforms that essentially become what we think of as First Temple Judaism. And so the idea is that somebody found a book, the book of Deuteronomy, which hadn't been known before at all, which claims to have been written by Moses, but which we can say quite clearly is not written by Moses. It was probably written around the time historically that it was found in the temple at that time, but it created this whole movement upon which really the entirety of Abrahamic religion, Islamo-Judeo-Christianity in some sense, has as its foundation. And it's not the only example of that, but anyway, there's lots of different ideas. And so Socrates, Plato through the mouth of Socrates, argues in his Republic here that it's going to be essential to tell a couple noble lies in order to achieve the good end of the just society. The myth of You might not have heard this one. I don't know. But I think it's kind of an interesting one anyway. The idea in it is Plato tells a story of afterlife where you are judged according to what you did in your life. And based upon how you lived your life, you're either sent to kind of a holding pen paradise or reform school. and essentially you spend 1,000 years then in one of those two pens, and if you've been in the paradise one, you get that because you were so good in life. But then once you're have spent 1,000 years just kind of in paradise, you forget all the good things that what the reasons that got you there in the first place. And so then when you're reincarnated, so after that 1,000 years you're reincarnated and sent back to Earth, you end up being quite dumb and doing all the wrong things, and then you go the wrong way in this cycle. Likewise, if you get all this punished, you get that being rotten beat out of you. You come back and you live a really good life, and so this cycle goes on until you accidentally, let's say, if the thing works out and you end up becoming a tyrant on the Earth life, whereupon you just get flushed down the drain at the end instead of getting reincarnated or put in prison and things like that. And so the worst thing you want to happen to you is to have lived a noble life, to have forgotten it all because of this 1,000 years of paradise, become a tyrant, and then that's the end of you, according to this particular myth in Plato. So it's an interesting idea anyway about reincarnation, about judgment, afterlife, and things like that, which is, again, 4 centuries before, for example, Christianity and the ideas of afterlife, and somewhat contemporaneous to how this idea of reincarnation is emerging in South Asia in terms of South Asian Indian religions. The Ring of Gyges. You may not have heard it in the form of as it's told in the Republic, but the idea that of somebody getting a hold of a magic ring that when you put it on it, you turn invisible. You've probably heard some stories about a magic ring that makes you go invisible, whether or not you've heard about Gyges. And the question that is brought up in this kind of thought experiment that Plato has in the Republic is, how would you behave if nobody could ever observe what you were doing? So would you use an invisibility ring to be a superhero who's doing all these good Wonder Woman or Superman style heroism, or would you kind of quickly start spying on people, see what they think about you, maybe steal some stuff, all the different kinds of things? The argument is that that when you have these, when you're kind of choosing superhero powers, Plato's argument is that you're not going to do pretty well when you have this one, so, in terms of being just. And then finally, this thought experiment of a utopia. So the idea that you're probably thinking about when you hear the name the Republic is Socrates kind of trying to paint a thought picture of how would a perfect society be. And this is really one of the very early times that's happened. And so later ones that we're familiar with, Thomas More's Utopia, so that coins the term utopia for these things, are definitely written having been familiar with Plato's work. And then that has created whole genres of both utopian literature, and then as we come into the postmodern realm in the second half of the 20th century and to the present, especially dystopian, because we've become, what's this utopia? Yeah. It's just, it's Toronto, right? No, I was going to say, what do we know about, what does utopian society look like? We know there's more transit, right? At the minimum, we would definitely have that relief line. That's for sure. And there'd be a subway station. The relief line's supposed to have a subway station right here, 1 block away. So someday, utopia. Okay. So we always use as our graphic that we advertise this meetup. We'd use this painting by Raphael in the Vatican called The School of Athens, where Raphael has combined all of these different philosophers from ancient Greece, but then actually all the way up through the Middle Ages to be all together in this picture. It represents then Western philosophy as it was understood and inherited by people at Raphael's time, the Renaissance. And right at the heart, it focuses on Plato and Aristotle, but also includes earlier philosophers like Socrates and the pre-Socratics, and people like Boethius and Averroes, who we've had a lecture on Boethius. We'll have to do Averroes, so we have to do the Western dependence on medieval Muslim philosophy, which ends up being a very important contribution. So in this painting at the center, Plato is pointing upward towards the heavens, which in a way he's like modeling, therefore symbolically caricaturing his idea of ideals or forms. So we're not worrying about the material world. We want to look upward and have our eyes gaze upward to the ideas of forms. And so that's this theory of forms that we talked about as more accurate reality than the material world that we tend to think of as reality. And so for Plato, these forms are atemporal, aspatial, immaterial, perfect, and material objects, by contrast, that we can sense are just mere reflections or shadows of these forms. By contrast, right next to Plato, in this painting, we have Aristotle and him represented here as empiricism. He's kind of going, whoa there, Plato, on the one hand, but he's also gesturing to the ground, in the physical world all around him, because he's essentially arguing with Plato that we should be grounding our philosophy a little bit more in the real world. We can maybe get to those ideas, but we have to first do our essentially legwork here in the material world, see what the material world has to teach us, and how that can then maybe allow us to extrapolate to these ideals instead of simply rejecting the material world and just using our minds only. So breaking with that knowledge comes through the deduction of abstract forms. Aristotle argues empirical study of physical things yields knowledge about their underlying causes and purposes. So we should be studying the world around us. So just as a background for these guys, if you're less familiar, so Plato was the greatest student of Socrates. He essentially creates the Western dialectical philosophy, which is modeled on Socrates' habit of asking difficult questions. So what sometimes you think of as the Socratic method of trying to inquire about what is the nature of a particular topic, trying to find a definition, trying to then challenge the definition through finding counterexamples that don't fit into that definition, refining your definition and trying to come to some understanding, but in the form of a dialectic or dialogue, so that it's not simply like the way Aristotle would write things. He would simply like write a treatise. There's a topic. He tells you what it is, rather than having books on absolutely every topic in the universe like Aristotle and then just explaining what it all is. Rather, it's engaging you, the reader, with the philosophical process and essentially an ongoing exploration in order to try to find meaning together, which maybe can't be limited to simply what you would write in a thesis statement. So because Socrates didn't write any of these things down and actually was quite dubious about the value of the written text, Plato did that, and so he's therefore the innovator then of these written dialogues that convey philosophical questions and modeled on Socrates. He himself founds a school which is called the Academy, and our word academy is in homage to Plato's original academy. And his famous student is Aristotle, who we've been mentioning. And so Aristotle then, Plato's greatest student, he systematized knowledge in just crazy wide-ranging fields: physics, biology, logic, politics, linguistics, metaphysics, et cetera, et cetera. There's a precursor, kind of the ancient idea of a scientific method, which is not quite what the modern idea of the scientific method is, but again, this empiricism. His school is called the Lyceum, which we use that word less in English, but it's a French word for school, for example. It's the main word. But anyway, you're used to the word Lyceum. And again, it's in honor of Aristotle's school, and famously then Alexander the Great. He's the tutor, for Alexander, who doesn't go on to be a philosopher, but is kind of a hands-on guy who decides to take this out of the academy or out of the Lyceum and into the real world and see what you can do with all of this information that they've come up with. And we'll just step back then to Socrates. Socrates is also in the painting here, but he's not right at the center of it. Somebody who obviously hugely influential on both Plato and then through Plato, Aristotle. Philosopher, so philosopher is a lover of Sophia, which is one of the Greek for wisdom, but is also a female goddess, so it's a female divine. And is credited then with this Western philosophical tradition as the first moral philosopher. So he is his predecessors, who, because of the importance of him and historically speaking, are termed essentially pre-Socratic. So in other words, the people who came before Socrates are especially concerned with questions about what they called at the time natural philosophy, which would be more like what we think of as being cosmology or science and things like that, what we now think of as physical science. And Socrates, now having so many people had that question, goes to turns it on to, let's look at some of these more metaphysical or human questions, moral questions. So as I mentioned, he left no texts, but he definitely walked around and bugged everybody in Athens. And one of the things is he would ask questions like, well, what does it mean to live a good life? What is the virtuous life? What are the qualities of that? Ultimately, he's tried by a jury that's set up by the Athenian democracy on charges that include things like corrupting the minds of youth and also impiety, and he is convicted and executed. And so part of the story and history of Socrates is, especially as recorded by Plato, is that he could have gotten away if he had wanted to, but that he chose to be subject to the law and he was not, and to essentially face death stoically, and actually becomes a model for the Stoics in a way by also illustrating in his view that even though people generally tend to really fear death, that he feels anyway that a philosopher doesn't need to be worried about death because we don't have any evidence that you're going to be tortured in these horrible ways, and maybe and you can just as easily, if you're going to make a leap of faith to think that that's going to happen, you can just as easily believe that something will happen that will be quite absolutely wonderful. And so if Plato's characterization of what Socrates' beliefs are, his, I think, idea is that by participating in that ultimate form, the form of the goodness itself, that one, essentially is returned to union with that one source in death, and so therefore death is not anything to be worried about. Okay. Yes, Jane. Wait, Jane, just a second. You have to talk to me.
Wasn't it Socrates that drank the hemlock?
Yes, Socrates drank hemlock. So the way the execution took place is, he's sentenced to death, and so they do it death by poison. He's able to drink the poison, hemlock.
Not that he drank it in advance of being condemned.
He did not do it in advance of being condemned. It's not just like to spite him, like they were going to cut his head off or something like that. He drinks the poison as part of his sentence, and so it's not like I'll show all of you. I'll kill myself with poison when you wanted to hang me or something. No, they execute him. They sent him to execution by poison, and he takes the poison. So one of the few, there's a lot of different, we've talked before, so especially when we've done a later generation of classical philosophy. So right now we're at the start of, classical philosophy after, the pre-Socratics, and so this is this golden era. When we've done later classical times, so the Roman imperial times, and what we sometimes call like later Greco-Roman, I have Mormon on my brain here, Greco-Roman philosophy, moral philosophy. Now that I said that, I don't remember what I was going to talk about. So that a lot of those later philosophies, so especially Stoicism and things like that, some of these Stoic values are things that continue to resonate on through Western society, and we still look back on people being Stoic or something like that as being a virtue, right? And so, but one of the main exceptions to that, generally speaking, in Western society, is that the Stoics were very much on board with, at certain point, for your honor or this or that, you're in a place where you really ought to honorably commit suicide, and so people like Cato, who is a very famous, I think he's a Stoic, but anyway, a very famous Republican member of the Republic at the Senate in Rome, at a certain point, because of political causes, feels that he has to commit suicide and does, I think stabs himself, not poisons himself. And that's just viewed as a very, very honorable thing to do. And so that he is a martyr in that same way, and same thing Socrates. And so that's like the one big one that hasn't resonated down, where we don't generally look upon this honorable suicide in the West, but that's most of the rest of Stoicism has made its way down. Yeah.
The one thing about Socrates' death, though, is that I think it was 101 or 501 jurors that were all responsible for sentencing him, even though they came up with the sentence of guilty. The tradition was that he could ask for a lesser sentence. Instead of asking for the lesser sentence, he went something outrageous that they wouldn't ever grant him, so they just sentenced him to death. So it wasn't... It kind of looks like it could be with valor. But in a way, it's kind of just kick you out.
He's kind of saying, well, look, I'm not guilty, so he's not going to take any of the easy ways out. So if you guys are going to go down and do this thing where you're charging me and you're going to use your powers in a democracy in order to do this, I'm not going to play the little game and say take all the different ways that I have as an out on this. Where I just accept having a slap on the wrist and agree, therefore, that I was in the wrong, like what you're really kind of trying to do. Instead, I'm going to stand for my principles and say I'm in the right, even if that means that you're going to execute me. Then if you have that conviction at the Athenian democracy, if the state has that conviction, then he'll accept that, and then history will then judge whether they think Socrates was right or whether they think the Athenian democracy was right, and so he generally won that gamble. If in terms of in the courtroom of history, if you, depending on how your view of life and death and whether you be better off not dying or not or whatever, that would be your, you can decide if you won otherwise, But yes, Kavanch.
If I remember correctly, I'm not sure about that, but there is a difference between sentencing and executing. So the sentence and execution.
Yes.
So they sentence him to death, but the execution is dubious because as far as I remember, it is almost like optional. Either to drink the poison or to escape from the prison.
Yeah, he can run away.
Yeah.
So he could have left. There's all the different ways that he could kind of say, I'm going to, abscond, and I don't have to accept that kind of authority. And indeed, by the way, when we talk 2 student generations later, Aristotle's like, I'm out of here. When the politics were going wrong, and suddenly Alexander's gone, and his whole party is in bad stead. Aristotle chooses to flee and he says, rather than allow the Athenians to mar their reputation a second time, by killing Aristotle off, obviously, in addition to Socrates. So you can go either way on this, but Socrates made his bed and decided he wanted to do that, and so anyway. Okay, so let's go back anyway away from the historical Socrates here, well, a little bit anyway, to this method of the characters in Plato's dialogues. So we'll talk a little bit about the difference between Socrates, the character in the dialogues, and Socrates, the historical figure who we've been talking about. So the characters in Plato's dialogues then engage in conversations that explore big philosophical questions. So they can be questions like, okay, what is virtue, which is the topic of the Meno, one of the dialogues, and what is beauty, which is the Hippias, the greater Hippias, the topic of that. And then other characters then, will give traditional definitions often, which Socrates then will proceed to pick apart, and then until they get really frustrated, and sometimes they leave, and that kind of thing, and then somebody else comes, and there's more dialogue, right? And so that brings us to, like I say, this Socratic problem, which is Socrates, as we said, didn't write anything. Plato is our major source. And so we're primarily accessing Socrates through Plato, who is his own brilliant philosopher. And so often then what we have to ask ourselves is how much of what Socrates is saying in Plato's writings is what Socrates, the historical person, would have said, and how much of it is what Plato is saying as a developing philosopher in his own right throughout his own kind of brilliant career. And so in general, this can be argued forever, but a general rule of thumb kind of model that a lot of scholars go to deal with this problem is they divide the dialogues essentially into kind of three major groupings: early, middle, and late. And we can kind of, I'm just doing it with my little cartoons here, but essentially in the early, when Plato's new still and is still way more in the shadow of his brilliant teacher, he maybe is writing way more exactly what kind of Socrates would have been writing about. When we get to the middle dialogues, his own ideas have developed more, and he's putting more of himself into what Socrates is saying in the dialogues. And by the end, we're probably hearing some things that would be quite anachronistic to Socrates. These are newer ideas that Plato has developed, even though they're still being put back into Socrates' mouth. And so the dialogue that we're doing today is right in the middle of that, so the Republic. So, like I said, it's around 380 BC, or published. And Socrates in this is the major character, but a lot of the philosophy he's presenting here reflects Plato's thought as opposed to maybe what the historical Socrates is saying. We can't know very easily. The one we're able, there are some other contemporaries, and so another student of Socrates, Xenophon, has written in his own dialogue and his own description of Socrates, who comes off quite different from Plato's Socrates. And also contemporaneous, we've done before when we had our lecture on Aristophanes, the Clouds, so this great originator of Greek comedy plays, wrote contemporary plays where he ridiculed Socrates miserably. And so you get a very different picture then of Socrates in the plays of Aristophanes. And so anyway, between those kind of different historical perspectives and some later stuff, those are the contemporaries, but then there's also later reflections. That's how we try to decide what is Plato and what's Socrates. So the dialogue here that we're dealing tonight, the Republic, the big question is, what is justice? Or at least that's the dialogue's overt question. It actually ends up having a bunch of related questions that are ultimately going to be, really, how do you live the best life, or how do you live a just life? How do you live a good life? Can you live a good life as a just life? So in this question then, what is justice? There's essentially a couple ways you can go with this in philosophy generally, not only just in Plato here, but also among the contemporaries. So one of these ideas is justice supramundane. So we've already been talking about Plato's theory of forms and how there are ideas that transcend and are more ideal and real than the material world. So you can kind of guess which side Plato's going to come down on in terms of this. In other words, are these ideas like justice eternal and based on some higher standard or power? And if so, though, what is it? And how do we understand what justice is and defined? Or is justice man-made? And if so, is it like merely conventional? And maybe that by merely conventional we mean perhaps maybe arbitrary, as it's developed just arbitrarily in all the different places where humans are? Or as all of the places it's developing, is there some kind of discernible basis for why different customs, even though they seem arbitrary, maybe they all have some logic to them because, for example, they have some essentially kernel of utility? Or is there something else, like, for example, is the basis or the main underlying truth of the universe essentially power or kill or be killed kind of thing? And so then all of these customs have that as their kind of basis, even if that's not an eternal concept. And so one of the ways that people contemporaneous to Socrates are asking that is, this phrase is man, the measure of all things. And so, in other words, if we look across the world, for example, at various religious precepts, some people oppose, for example, eating pork. Some people oppose eating cattle. Some people don't even eat onions. Some people, it's a big sin not to have coffee. So, if you take this kind of a gamut of, things for some people, this is the end all be all, no coffee. Is that, is there any kind of universal sense that we can make of that, or is this, arbitrary? So, contemporary to Socrates, one of these, another philosopher, a guy named Protagoras, is famous for this quote, "Man is the measure of all things." And so as far as Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle are concerned, Protagoras and his associates are part of a school whom Socrates and Plato and Aristotle term sophists. Sophist becomes a very negative term. In a lot of senses, Plato will argue that sophists are not philosophers or not true philosophers. In a lot of senses, it's hard to make this distinction. They are kind of a philosopher, depending on what you think a philosopher is. As far as Plato's concerned, Platonic philosophers are the real philosophers, and so these guys are not true philosophers. I mean, if we look at the other ideas from the outside, a lot of people can't see this. So Aristophanes, as far as he's concerned, in the play The Clouds, Socrates is a sophist, and he is doing exactly the same thing that the sophists are doing. So anyway, so this is kind of like a little bit of name calling. But we tend to use this term because Plato and Aristotle, in a way, sense, at least back in their day, won, and so we call these guys sophists. So sophists like Protagoras, like him, argue that there, for example, all these relative customs that we see, that we just went through in terms of like dietary customs and other kinds of moral customs. We were talking before about societies where different kinds of suicide are honorable, other societies where they don't think that there is ever cause to commit suicide, or there may be any other number of moral ideas about suicide. That this illustrates that there's not any kind of truth absolute, and rather, so for example, if we're looking at things that Aristotle and Plato see as like qualities, things like warm or cold, that in fact there isn't anything that said that something is inherently warm. It is only simply relative. Something that you think is warm is only, it's maybe real warm here in Canada, but let's say in I don't know, I was in Arizona last week, so they won't think of it as that warm, right? So it's relative to other things, colder things. So by contrast, into this position then that there's no such thing as an absolute, then are there then such a thing as fundamental human rights? So if we agree with the sophists, can we assert that any of human rights are fundamental? If customs and morality are relative, then what's the basis for declaring that particular laws are, let's say, rights in that fundamental sense, and that are fundamental to all human beings, right? And so I think that maybe people are in tension with these two extremes. You might have agreed with the sophist in the last slide. You might also have a tendency to think that some of the rights or something like that are for humans are fundamental, and some things are fundamentally immoral always. And indeed, almost all of functional society takes a middle path between these two and is actually pulling from both sides. But between, anyway, the sophists and Plato, there's not going to be a middle ground. They want to argue both their own extreme on this. Okay, so we'll do the little bit. I just want to give a little sense of how dialogues go, and so I'm going to go in a little bit more detail to the first book of the Republic, where Socrates is setting this all up with his different dialogue partners, asking them questioning them about what is justice. And so his first companion in the Republic that he's this guy brings up the topic of justice. It's an old man named Cephalus. He, generally speaking, is expressing a bunch of traditional Greek pagan piety that ancient Athenians would have had. And as far as he is concerned in his old age here, what's just for him is that he doesn't lie and he isn't cheating anybody, and most important, he's going to be able to die having paid off all his debts. So he's left that all behind, and so that's going to be, he'll have lived a just life, right? And so Socrates is like, you walk into Socrates' little trap there, Cephalus. So Socrates wonders whether, is paying back what you owe, is that always just? So you're defining that, paying off your debts, that's just, but let's use, a couple different counter arguments. I can think of an example here, Socrates says. Suppose that a friend, when he was in his right mind, had deposited arms, big weapons with me, and then he asked them when he's not in his right mind, so then he goes out of it and he's nuts, and he asks for the gun back or whatever. Ought I give the arms? Should I give him his weapon back? Nobody would say that I ought to give it back to him, or that it would be right for me to give it back to him. any more than that they would say that I ought to always speak the truth to somebody who's in that condition. So in other words, if this guy is nuts and dangerous, I should actually, if I have to tell him some white lies to calm him down or anything like that, nobody's going to call me a bad person for doing that. They're going to be happy that I, calmed him down, even if it involved lying, is Socrates' case. And maybe not everybody agrees, because later philosophers have argued that you can't ever lie, and that that's a moral absolute. But anyway, this is Socrates' case in this case. So giving something back isn't always good, because Socrates can poke a hole in that definition as far as Socrates is concerned. So who's up next? So Cephalus decides that it's kind of out of his league. He didn't sign up for a big Platonic dialogue, and so he leaves, and he leaves his young heir Polemarchus to the discussion. Polemarchus then jumps up and defines justice in kind of personal terms, me terms, that as he's kind of thinking about it and living his own life. So he defines it as what's just is to help one's friends and harm one's enemies. So it's kind of utility, maybe. And again, Socrates thinks through the consequences of that definition and offers a bunch of objections, because this is kind of how the sense of these kind of dialogues go. And so, okay, well, do we really know who your friends are? So is this something that you're going to be able to act and behave justly? He says, quote, "Many a man who is ignorant of human nature, who has friends who are actually bad friends." So there's all these people who you think of as being your friends, but maybe they aren't acting in your interests at all. Maybe they're doing all kinds of things that are reckless and getting you to do, whatever, go out and do reckless things that are actually not in your best interest. And in that case, according to your kind of overt idea that they're actually kind of functional enemies, your morality was that, well, you should actually then harm those people because they're actually functionally your enemy, not your friend. And by the way, and contrariwise, people who you maybe overtly think of your enemies, who actually maybe are actually doing things that are functionally quite good for you. And so anyway, so in these kind of cases, this is an objection that Socrates has. He has a bunch of other ones, but one of them ultimately does it really seem like it's just to doing bad harm to anybody, including your enemies? Socrates argues a little bit against that one too. Okay, so next character in the dialogue is a sophist. Actually, all these guys are real historical figures, although, again, these are characters that Plato is creating the speeches based on either how he thinks they would act or based on him knowing history and what has happened in the intervening time, things that are either ironic for them to have said way back then, or things that that are telling, because Plato knows the rest of the story, kind of thing. Yeah.
And Cephalus is the father of Polemarchus.
Right.
And Polemarchus and Thrasymachus are brothers? Is that how it goes? Cephalus is the father.
Thrasymachus is actually a brother? I didn't know.
Two of them are brothers. One is the father. I think Cephalus is the father.
Okay. So I didn't pay attention to Thrasymachus being a brother then. If so, then. But the Thrasymachus, though, is a sophist historically. We don't have too much of him out of the dialogue that Plato wrote, but in any event, are you raising your hand? No, okay. Anyway, so he's a guy, though, and who is a sophist. And in this dialogue, then, Plato has him argue what is essentially a position of the sophist, which is, in this case, he argues, justice is nothing else than the interest of the stronger. So he has provided essentially that definition, which, I don't know, there's a bunch of different times that we get to this point in some kinds of, some philosophies, right? That it's not quite might makes right, but it's sort of like that, right? Are you writing messages to me or just writing things down?
No.
Okay, sometimes you write things and then you're saying, wrap it up. No. Okay, I'm sorry. Okay. I think we're doing okay. Yeah. Okay. So what does Thrasymachus say? So Thrasymachus is talking about now, he kind of bringing up this topic of the different forms of government that the Greeks know about at this time. So there are tyrannies. By tyrannies, that essentially means we use that word, tyrant is very, very negative. It's also negative in Plato, but the term wouldn't have been necessarily negative to Greek city-states. Essentially, a lot of times what happens is you need, you might have a political turmoil where, I don't know, let's say everybody voted to have Brexit, but they can't figure out how to make it happen because nobody wants to do it all the different ways that they do it. And so if you have a tyrant who comes in and just makes all the hard decisions, then it actually gets done. And so in a lot of cases, the city-states, both in ancient Greece and in Renaissance Italy, for example, would actually want to have a tyrant, in Italy it's called a podesta, come in and rule for a little while to clean up some of this kind of stuff. So
they're also psychopaths.
they could also, well, so some are psychopaths. So if that's the case, so that's some of the examples. For example, in ancient Greece, in general, there's a bunch of famous tyrants of Syracuse and Sicily who end up doing a lot of, quite reckless things. So anyway, tyrannies, there are democracies and there are aristocracies. So aristocracies rule by kind of a hereditary nobility. And the difference in these forms of government, according to Thrasymachus here, so again, this is the sophist arguing in the dialogue, or Plato arguing through the voice of a sophist. Different forms of government make laws that are either democratical, aristocratical, tyrannical, with a view to their several interests. And these laws, which are made by them for their own interest, are the justice which they deliver to their subjects, and him who transgresses them they punish as a breaker of law and unjust. So what we can say here, that even though these are very different kinds of societies, they're societies that are ruled by tyrants, by aristocrats, by democracies, that every one of them and everyone's making laws, and they're all making laws that maybe are functionally quite different, but they all have an end, and that end is their own interests, the interests of a democracy, the interest of the tyrant, the interests of the aristocrats. But that what they call then the justice what they do to impose on their subjects, they call that justice, right? And anything that the subjects do that's against their interests, they call injustice. And in the case of the democracy in Athens, they, for example, execute Socrates, right, for being unjust. And so Thrasymachus goes on to say then, and that is what I mean when I say that in all the states there's the same principle of justice, which is the interest of the government. And as the government must be supposed to have power, the only reasonable conclusion is that everywhere there is one principle of justice, which is the interest of the stronger. Okay, that doesn't stop Socrates. So Socrates has some objections. So Socrates wonders then whether Thrasymachus here means justice is what is the actual benefit. This is kind of the same trick we did before with the last guy you talked to. Anyway, I'm forgetting. Anyway, the benefit of this, is it the actual benefit of the strong so that the government know what's actually in their benefit, or is it just what they think is in their benefit? And so don't strong rulers, Socrates asks, sometimes make mistakes and create laws that are actually to their own disadvantage? So they may well think, if I pass this tax, and it's a 80% tax, and everybody has to put, and I tax that all into in my coffers, I'll suddenly be a very rich tyrant. But the problem may be the economy collapses. There may well be like a revolution that happens. You may get executed as a result of that. Then it turns out that tax, even though you thought it was in your best interest, it turns out it wasn't in your best interest. Thrasymachus doesn't largely agree. Kind of just says, more or less, these guys, the true power knows what they want, and so he doesn't really agree. Socrates has a bunch of other objections. So he asks, for example, what's the aim of art in general? We're trying to have the exercising here of the art or discipline of doing justice. And so he now wants to reason about different kinds of arts or disciplines by analogy. And so he goes to one of his favorite ones, those always medicine and doctors. So is the art of medicine, he asks, is that practice for medicine's own sake? Or is it for the body? Or what's the goal here that a doctor, a physician in practicing medicine, trying to cure people? Or is it just medicine, right? And so Socrates argues that no physician, insofar as he's a physician, considers his own good in what he prescribes, but the good of his patient. So he's not just thinking of what the doctor's good. Yeah, Shaheen, one sec. But the good of his patient, for the true physician is also a ruler, having the human body as his subject.
I was just going to make a comment as to someone might have taken the case up with Socrates that is not true because there are physicians who go into it for the money,
Yes.
therefore for their own good, and there are those who prescribe medications to patients based on how good the pharmaceuticals sell it to them.
Right. And I was thinking of another a counter example too when we just read this one of there's a lot of physicians who get these God complexes, and so then maybe they are doing it in that sense for themselves as opposed to healing anybody. In terms of the money objection, they do at this point have a big, long side argument about money because money makes everything complicated. But ultimately, kind of the idea of it is that the art, on the one hand, the art is done for the art's sake, and the goal of getting profit is kind of a side thing, is what they're trying to get to. Yes.
Yeah, the big equation now is public opinion, i.e. opioids.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so, I mean, obviously there's a lot going on right now. And so this analogy is complicated, especially in our modern world where we have a lot more physicians and it's a lot bigger scope. It was a little bit easier back in Socrates' day in terms of less complicated medical issues. Okay, so anyway, that said, Socrates is satisfied with his argument, and so he concludes. Then I said, Thrasymachus, there's no one in any position of rule, so nobody who's in a rule, in any of these kind of arts that he brings up and talks about from physicians to everything else, who insofar as he is a ruler, considers or enjoins what is for his own interest, but is always for the interest of his subject, or is suitable for his art, to that he looks, and to that alone he considers in everything which he says and does. So that's kind of Socrates' position, even if Thrasymachus isn't necessarily buying it. In fact, Thrasymachus has a counterpoint that seems pretty spot on. So, for example, to Socrates, he kind of laughingly or snarkily thinks that shepherds are practicing their art for the benefit of the sheep. I mean, that's a counterexample. And he further argues that the unjust person who commits injustice is always happier than the just person. So if you could, to your point about reputation and all this kind of thing, or public opinion, they're making essentially the case of, if you could be unjust every day as a ruler, but then have the reputation for being a really just ruler, and no matter what you did, everybody thinks, oh, he's so just. Then you'd be super happy, is what Thrasymachus would say, because you get to have your cake and eat it too, and so that's kind of the idea. And so as far as Thrasymachus is concerned, the model that they have contemporaneously, this guy, the tyrant of Syracuse, illustrates, I don't know if he's exactly that time, but anyway, the tyrants that are living happily, these guys are happy, unjust people because they are able to just satisfy all of their desires. Benjamin, you need to get done. That's okay.
So is the justice of today a good justice for tomorrow in Socrates' eyes, or Thrasymachus, or anyone?
So you're saying like the idea of having consequences
that which is justice
down?
today, considered justice by definition, is that good justice in the future? Right.
Yeah, and so they haven't at this point considered it temporally, but ultimately you can imagine if we're going to get fast forward to what we know of Plato, in terms of his idea that big ideas, are the things that are eternal and unchanging, that the real justice or the true justice is going to be true in the future, it's going to be true in the past, and it's true in the present. And that the kinds of man-made justices that we have at best in our various temporal expressions are participating in true justice, and in as much as they're participating in it, they're just, but in any event, they're different because of those kind of contexts.
So what's true justice if it isn't man-made?
So the question is, what's true justice if it isn't man-made? More dialogue coming. So we'll have to see. So yeah, what is it? So a lot of people on Thrasymachus' side here so far, I think, or Protagoras. So okay, we'll just say Socrates is going to try to wrap this up with these first guys. He goes through a whole bunch of arguments about what he believes in terms of tyrants and about just behavior and unjust behavior and all these kind of things. And he ultimately is essentially expressing this, like you say, belief that that tyrants only seem happy, but in fact, that we have a quotation of this, which would say, "Wickedness never was happiness." That all of these kinds of unsatiable desires and everything that they have are ultimately insatiable, and they're also hollow because they aren't actually participating in anything that is good and true, and so therefore they aren't actually experiencing any true goodness or true happiness by their behavior. And so he's saying that. But at that point or other, he does exactly what you've anticipated, which is that he's jumped so far ahead that he hasn't made his case about how we could understand what truth would be outside of what convention is. And so he has to then, this is only the first book of the whole Republic. He's now going to spend the entire rest of the text trying to get us to that place. And so essentially he has to say, look, I'm sorry guys, we didn't do what I originally said. We were going to define justice, and you really, talked me into, sophist comes over, and so I have to yell at him. Anyway, so this sophist guy comes over, and so you really got me talking about things like, whether a just or unjust person is going to be able to be happy or truly happy, and we haven't even figured out what justice is. So I'm still more ignorant here than when I even started, Socrates kind of says. And so, and I think you guys are all nervous because this is like only the first of 8 books. But we took that, so we're not going to be here. I'm sorry, the first of 10 books. Yes, and so yeah.
It's even worse.
It's even worse. You guys are going to hear a long time. Yeah, there's 2 more in my notes here. Forgot about those. And so anyway, but we're actually not going to take them all in that kind of detail. I wanted to kind of show you kind of a sense of this dialogue nature where there's multiple characters that are each presenting different ideas, and they are talking back and forth and making cases and counter cases and examples and counter examples. So the central analogy of the meat of the book of the Republic is Socrates' comparison of a just man with a just society. So really, because people at this time, they lack all of our modern theories of psychology. So we have all of this in the last century development of all kinds of ideas of inner self and psychology that didn't exist in the ancient world. Socrates kind of argues that it's really quite difficult to get inside a person's head and see all the little pieces and look for their inner motivations. And so he argues that it's going to be a lot easier if we take the canvas really big and we look at how a just city works, and then just understand by analogy how a person's going to work. And so that's getting us to the meat of this thing that we've probably been thinking about, is the Republic itself. So this coming up with this utopia. And so because, though, we get to it from this place, he's kind of backing into it as an analogy for how we're looking at a just man and how we're looking at internal motivation of the soul, there's we have to question whether he actually means it when he's talking about the society that he's kind of proposing, since it's being proposed as an analogy. So when we're reading this hypothetical state, as we read through the Republic, we often take little details of it and we say, boy, Plato is absolutely in favor of censorship, he's in favor of eugenics, all these kind of things. He wants to have that imposed on societies. The question is that the case, or or not, based on this thing that I've just said, and also, number 2, based on the fact that we have this dialogue format where Socrates is maybe proposing all kinds of different hypothetical things which are provoking and stimulating conversation, but they may not be the conclusion that you'd ever have, but rather they're presenting ideas that are leading to further thought, right? And so therefore, the whole thing then, is it meant to be about the mind only, or are we really trying to make a portrait of the actual state? In some sense, because of everything we just talked about, it's meant to be an analogy for the mind and understanding the mind in a just person and living the meaningful or good life. But on the other hand, there's all these crazy details in this state that it seems like hard-pressed you've taken the analogy so far that you wonder, well, how could that possibly be about somebody's brain or something like that? At this point, we're just giving ideas to how to, live a society, right? And so those are the kind of two sides of looking at this argument. So because, just to look now at the template of the state that Socrates is kind of working out with his interlocutors, because the state needs certain tasks to be performed. So as we're making up the characteristics of what this ideal state is going to look like, Socrates divides its populace into three specialized classes, who are the workers, the guardians, who are the military, and the guardian rulers. And so by analogy, these represent Plato's understanding of the three parts of the soul. And so these parts are the appetitive, the spirited, and the rational. And so essentially, corresponding to the workers or artisans who are doing kind of all the labor, that's essentially this kind of your appetites or base or carnal desires that you would have as a natural being, as an animal. Then you have the spirited component, which is essentially the military. And if you think of proud hoplites in the Greek tradition, who get really angry very easily over their honor and that kind of a thing. That's still an emotional thing, but it's different from the kind of base animal emotions maybe, and so that's how this works. And then ultimately, there's your rational component of your mind, which is essentially, when it's functioning healthily as far as Socrates is concerned, is ruling, since your mind is being ruled by that rational or logical part, hopefully in alliance with the spirited part, so that indignation becomes righteous indignation as opposed to just vain anger and that kind of a thing, and that is therefore controlling the carnal parts and keeping it so that you aren't always a slave to your carnal passions. Yes, Eugene.
Could it be parallel to the ego and superego in Freud?
So I would say it doesn't have that yet, and so I think it's different, but certainly we have a lot more and newer models of how we understand psychology and the psyche and things like this. What I'd say here is that it's not parallel, but rather before we had any of those kind of things, so 2,300 years or whatever beforehand, we're looking at Plato trying to come up with an idea to give a theory of motivation. How is your soul working in order to be motivated? Valerie has a comment, or probably a very important clarification.
It's actually kind of basic Freud. Both the id and the superego are unconscious, and I don't think Plato had a sense of the unconscious. Right. Only the ego is conscious, and that would be the rational or logical. It mediates between the needs of the outside world and the inner impulses, including the unconscious ones.
Yeah, very good point. Thank you so much for that. So there's no theory of unconscious here at all. So essentially there's this idea as Plato's trying to figure out how people are motivated, including introspection, he's not thinking of unconscious motivations or anything like that, or subconscious motivations. And so instead he's looking at, a mind that is potentially at war with itself, or that is operating harmoniously when ruled by logic. Oh, yes.
How did we slip in the soul, the three parts of the soul, rather
How did we slip into the word soul?
Rather than the three parts of the mind.
So again, we also don't have a theory of brain, like we now have. And so now, because of neuroscience and all that kind of thing, where we are much more aware of the chemical and they didn't have anything to do with electrical, and other kinds of properties, that are happening. We'll have Michael Ferguson back here to tell us about brain mapping and brain function and all those kind of things. They're only a few hundred years after they've figured out that real thinking is going on in that part of your body. The idea that they still have is that thought is not just only taking place in brain, and indeed maybe it's not, but in any event, and so they're talking about essentially our understanding of consciousness and giving word to that as something like soul, as opposed to I mean, you may be aware that, maybe 1,000 years earlier than, not even that, people think that all thought is coming from your heart or something like that, as opposed to, brain, because they just don't simply have that information yet.
I think you have to remember that Plato thinks that the soul is everlasting. So even after your body dies, your soul would go into this state of reincarnation where you would essentially get to pick what your next life was. So when he's talking about like the appetitive, spirited, and rational, he's talking about that one part of you that is everlasting, whatever part that is, brain, soul, whatever, spirit, that is what he's trying to balance, the three parts of whatever that is into whatever comes next.
Right, and so that's very different from our understanding of brain and physical matter, right? Because again, we're getting to this point when we have talked about this theory of forms and the eternal, the material world, including one's brain and that kind of thing, for Plato, is not where the true reality is. The true reality then is the immaterial part of you, which is soul. So, yeah, Ivan.
For Aristotle, the brain is just a radiator. It's what cools. But I think the heart, like the Hebrews, is also what's considered to be the part of the rational part.
Yeah.
And
so they're a way of circulation, and so they're thinking that maybe that's what's sending commands or whatever to the whole body and that kind of thing. So.
Also, psyche, the Greek word, has a religious connotation, and Socrates is a defender of, and certainly employs traditional religious terms. For example, in one of the middle dialogues, the Phaedrus, he stops at a spot on the river near Athens, and with his interlocutor, Phaedrus, he says, this place is holy or sacred.
Yeah.
And he talks about the gods and how when one is amongst the forms, one is in the train of various gods. So if you were a ruler, you'd be in the train of Zeus, or of a guardian of Ares.
Yeah. So you made a very good point, which I think a bias that we tend to have in the post-Enlightenment universe is that we look at philosophers. We think of philosophers maybe as being largely atheistic. And we naturally look back into the past and we see these ancient guys and we assume that they are totally irreligious people. But in point of fact, when we're even looking here at Plato's metaphysics and his talking about idealism, the spiritual universe as being more real than the physical carnal realm or something like that, this is a significantly more spiritual metaphysics than what Christianity ends up with. So Christianity is frankly not as willing to just simply discard the physical world, as Plato's going to be. And so I'm going to get to you. So Valerie has a comment, and that's the last one we're going to take because we have to plow forward a little.
We're short of time, but I have a kind of burning comment.
Yes.
I can't remember whether it's in the Republic or another of Plato's works, but he has one of those multi-step, logically very syllogistic arguments where the pivot is the forms are invisible, the soul is invisible, ergo the two are in communion, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know if anybody who's recently read the Republic remembers that one, but it's like a 8 or 10 step argument where therefore the soul is like the forms is immortal, et cetera, et cetera.
The analogy of the crossed line or the divided line, I mean, Okay, we're just going to go forward, guys. I appreciate all these comments. We have a really erudite audience, and I love it always. We'll try to move forward because otherwise we'll be here until midnight. And so in this analogy, so we've been talking about how your brain is going to be working best if the whole rational or logical part, I'm not brain, your soul. Now I've gotten brain on my mind because we've been talking about this. So your soul is going to be operating properly if its rational part as opposed to its spirited and its carnal parts, or let's say worker and military parts. are actually in charge. And so just as that part of the soul should be ruling properly, in Plato's view, it should be ruling the individual, then relying on the support of the, relying on the support of the spirited component to rein in the desires of the appetites, so too the ideal state should be ruled by the rational class, which is to say the philosophers, right? So in the same way that that part of your soul is operating your body in a just individual, in a just state, philosophers ought to be kings, right? So we have, for example, we mentioned that ship-estate analogy. There's the state is like a ship, we'll say, an analogy. For the ship to operate effectively, you probably want the person with the most expertise and knowledge to serve as the pilot. However, if it happens that the sailors just pick who they want to be the pilot out of the whole group of sailors, without even worrying about that expertise, and you just do it based on popularity or whether they're been on a reality TV show or something like that, then what happens to the ship-estate? So this is kind of an argument against democracy, the perils of democracy.
Yeah, but he might have a more tranquil ship.
The ship might be more tranquil?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, well, so because actually there's all kinds of skills that the pilot doesn't have in terms of keeping everybody happy, but he makes it not crash. So that's the trade-offs. So the proposed characteristics of the Republic continue here. So just to list off a bunch of different things, we can't treat these at length. So Socrates has a real strong position in terms of censoring poetry. And so in his view, all of the he's not anti-religious, but what he doesn't like in traditional Greek religion, all the mythological tales you might be familiar with, where, for example, Zeus is a philanderer and all these kind of things. Dionysius or Bacchus is a big drunk, or any other things where people, or Ares is having an affair with Aphrodite and all these kind of things. What he says, Socrates more or less says, if a bad person then is caught, or a person is caught doing bad things and cheating and drinking and all this kind of things that they might do, then they have to say, well, that's what Zeus did, so what can I do? This kind of a thing. And so Socrates argues then that in an ideal republic, poets are only going to tell, the media here is only going to tell stories where the gods do things that people can emulate as good behavior. Because, as far as Socrates is concerned, that's the way the gods actually are. They're not like the philanderers of the traditional mythology of Homer and Hesiod. Okay. There's also, it goes stronger even than censorship. So in his plans then for this guardian class, military, and also the philosopher king, Socrates makes a number of proposals that diverge kind of starkly from traditional societies. I have my picture here from Logan's Run, because once we start getting into these things, I think of this kind of crazy state. So for example, reproduction is regulated by the state, and so sexual partners are overtly chosen by lot, so you don't know who you're going to get. It'll just be like chosen by kind of lottery or something like that. Except, here's one of the noble lies. We're actually, secretly having people who are figuring out how to do good selective breeding or eugenics in order to produce the kind of best babies, and you're only telling them that it's by chance because you don't want to freak everybody out and make them really angry. So anyway, so they all believe it's by lottery, but in fact, you've got this great eugenic program going on. And then ultimately, then all the resulting offspring are raised by the state, and they're ignorant of their actual biological parents. And so essentially, you've destroyed the family structure as it traditionally exists and all of those kind of motivations. And instead, the loyalty, instead of to parents and family and as your main connection group, the connection is to the society.
And then you get into myth of the metals.
The myth of the metals. We're not going to have enough time, but there's all of those kind of, yeah. So yeah, then there's also a long myth of the metals. There's all kinds of great stuff in this. You should read the whole thing. Okay, another thing that kind of, makes all of the people that Socrates is talking to, Socrates kind of just skims over this, but then they're like, wait a second, go back to that, what you said about the free love thing, and everybody can, share, sexually sharing, and that the women are also, the male and female guardians are together, they're educated together, and by the way, we do education in the gymnasium, and the gymnasium is Greek for nakedtorium, and so does that mean that all the women are going to be in the nakedtorium with all of us, and and all this kind of things? And Socrates is like, yeah, Okay. So anyway, so there's the male and female guardians then should have the same education, and he outlines a curriculum that should include arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music, which, not by coincidence, those 4 disciplines ultimately become known as the quadrivium in the Western tradition. And so those, alongside another 3 disciplines, the trivium, which are grammar, rhetoric, and logic, or dialectic, those form what you've probably heard of, the 7 liberal arts. And so those are formalized at the end of the Roman Empire by Martianus Capella as the 7 liberal arts, the curriculum that of medieval, essentially all late antiquity and all medieval like universities and everything like that, all the way up until British prep schools, really, a century ago. And so that's the basis of education. But somewhat rare, Plato here for Aristotle doesn't have the same egalitarian position on whether women can be philosophers and things like that as Plato has. So Aristotle has a more regressive view in terms of gender than Plato has here. Okay. Anyway, we're going to try to plow through, unless you, because we're getting to the point. I just want to plow through and we can have discussion after. Okay. So if that wasn't enough, to make it so that all of the people who Plato is talking to or Socrates is talking to in this dialogue think it's going to be pretty hard to get anybody to set up this state. Socrates has like another straw to break the camel's back, which is that he more or less says all these guardians also aren't going to have private property either. So there's essentially, they're going to be the elite class, and so the workers are getting taxed to provide everything for this class, but they're more or less keeping everything in common, and they don't have any kind of needs, but they also aren't going to have amassing all this kind of luxury and live these kind of idle, luxurious lives either. They're going to instead have this moderation with essentially shared property, and so that's just one more, way to make it very difficult to maybe make this idealized state ever exist. So what is such a society, when we have that and all the other characteristics in the picture that we have, would that such a thing be possible? Would such a thing be desirable? I've argued here before, when we look at these kind of, that very interestingly, a very strange successor to Greek philosophers that a lot of times people don't immediately connect with these kind of ideas is monasteries. So one of the main successors of ancient philosophy ultimately in the West is when all of the Romans who were left, the scholars and everybody like that, go into Roman villas. They make different little enclosed societies where they give up private property amongst each other. They eliminate the traditional family. In some cases, there will be an adjacent nunnery, as in, for example, the Venerable Bede's double monastery at Yarrow in Northumbria, where there's an entire group of philosopher women nuns, along with philosopher male monks like Bede, over which the whole thing is ruled by an abbess when these double monasteries happen. And so anyway, their goal then is to essentially free themselves from all of the different carnal and other kinds of passions that would happen as they withdraw from society and focus on contemplation. So it's not as weird and alien to the Republic maybe as you might think. So to wrap up, to get to your question, of how can we get to some kind of standard or understanding of what justice could possibly be if it's not man-made. Plato then spends the real meat of his dialogue trying to get there, and it's very complicated, and we don't have the time to go through it in huge amounts, but I'll try to set it up a little bit. So we've talked about how the two realms, as far as Plato is concerned, are the sensible realm, which we might call the material world, the things that we can touch with our 5 senses, smell and hear and all those kind of things, see. And then opposite that, we have the intelligible realm, the realm that I make my little brain icon, but it actually should be a soul icon, which is to say your soul can sense things that are in the intelligible realm, which include these ideas like good, virtue, love, beauty. And these are the things that in part the society of the Republic is designed for, in the same way that the monastery is designed for, so that you can get rid of, the philosopher kings are able to get away from all of these kind of basic stuff that everybody's doing in family life and every other kind of thing, and instead are able to focus on contemplating the real big ideas. So what is then the good? A lot of question is, in contemporaries, is it just pleasure? Is that good? And so obviously, a lot of times, this is an argument that people sometimes would make, and even contemporaries, that good is pleasure or at least absence of pain. And so, for example, sometimes, we think creative activity, that gives us pleasure, so that's good. Obviously, creative activity is pleasurable and therefore good, right? But then what happens if you do violent activity, right? Well, that might, for a sociopath, like you were talking about, the tyrant of Sicily, he had a lot of things that he might have done that, caused him a lot of pleasure, seemingly, and yet somehow we don't think of those things as having been good, to torture people and all that kind of thing, right? And so maybe then pleasure isn't good as easily. At least this is not a clear-cut case or argument. So certainly not for Plato. So Plato, as Socrates here argues, that there's got to be some kind of standard for measuring goodness other than pleasure. Oops. Just that does that when the air conditioning goes on, or the heater, hopefully.
Sorry. I have to come back.
It usually comes right back. I'll ad-lib. The end. No, we'll get to the thing. Okay, so we mentioned the sensible world, and how each one of our senses has a part of the body or whatever whose function is doing that sensing, seeing, tasting, smelling, touching. Most of these are not deficient, as Plato argues here in the Republic, or Socrates. Plato argues through Socrates. So, for example, I can use my fingers to feel objects, and I can use my tongue to taste things without having anything else have to help my tongue out in order to do that kind of thing. By contrast, he argues that sight and our eye and seeing is something that's deficient because we can't see things without the aid of something else. So, I could have my eyes could be working here really, really good, and then if the screen goes blank, I can't see anything because it's black, right? So we also need light. And so essentially, seeing is a deficient sense as far as Socrates' argument here is. And so this argument we made, so we talked about one of these analogies, the analogy of the sun. So he suggests in the same sense then that we need that light in order to even see, and the sun is that physical source of light, and that was so much more true in the ancient world when pretty much all the light was coming from the sun. They had candles like these, but they, if we turn everything off here, the candles, and we're trying to do this with just candles. Anyway, we're very aware of using artificial light, but the sun was a bigger deal even back then. So what Socrates says in the Republic, when we turn our eyes to things whose colors are no longer illuminated by the light of day, but by night lights, the eyes are dimmed and seem nearly blind, as if clear vision were no longer in them. Yet when one turns them on things illuminated by the sun, they say clearly, and the vision appears in the same eyes. So the difference here is not the eyes, the difference here is the kind of light we're getting, right? Well, understand then that the soul, in the same way, when it focuses on something illuminated by truth and what is, it understands, knows, and apparently possesses understanding. But when it focuses on what is mixed with obscurity, on what comes to be and passes away, it opines and is dimmed and changes his opinions this way and that, and seems bereft of understanding. So this is an argument that you can kind of see even him making, and this is based on all these pre-Socratic ideas that go before this. But essentially, when our intelligible faculties of our soul are focused in on something that is fully eternal, we see that very clearly. But when we mix up that idea with things that are saying come to be and pass away, so things that are like material instances, when we're talking about the justices of today, yesterday, these little human-made justices, if we get that all mixed up in it, we're going to be very dimmed, like trying to see things just by candlelight or in the dark, as opposed to looking, by sunlight. So the analogy then is we need then for our eyes to be able to use sight, we need to have physical light the source of physical light is the sun. In that same way, for our souls to perceive ideas, our mind, not really our brain here, but anyway, our mind, they require some sort of spiritual illumination, which is to say truth, and that source, Socrates argues, is the goodness, the source, the one. So that brings us then to the form of good. So he says, Socrates says here, so that which gives truth to things known and the power to know the knower is the form of the good. So not only just the truth to the things known, but also even the power that we have, our sense of being able to do it, because in the same way that we need light in order to see, we need to have this from the good in order to know good. And that is the form of good. And though it is the cause of knowledge and truth, it is also the object of knowledge. Both knowledge and truth are good things, but the good is other and more beautiful than they. In the visible realm, light and sight are rightly considered sun-like, but it is wrong to think that they are the sun. And so, in that same analogy, here it is right to think of knowledge and truth as good-like, but it is wrong to think of either of them is the good, for the good is yet more prized. So, again, it's all reasoning by analogy here, right? So let's take that analogy right over the finish line. So the sun provides not only the power of being seen for things seen, but, as I think you will agree, also the generation and growth and nurture, though again, it is not itself generation. So the sun isn't really causing all the energy that's allowing plants and animals and everything like that to exist on the earth, keeping us warm and all those sort of things. But we agree that it's not itself generation, it's just the cause of it, right? Excuse me. Similarly, with things known, in this analogy, you will agree that the good is not only the cause of their becoming known, but the cause that they are, the cause of their state of being, and although good is not itself a state of being, but something transcending far beyond it in dignity and power. So it's beyond even any of those things in the same analogy as the sun. So in the same way that you can't look directly at the sun with the naked eye without burning your eyes, so too the good can't be directly comprehended by the mind. Rather, it must be indirectly felt by its illumination. So as we're seeing all of these other concomitant principles like virtue and justice and everything else. So there we are. And we stopped long before 10:30, so we're doing pretty good. Questions? Yes?
Okay, so I don't know if you touched on this before I came in, but apparently Plato was a little bit freaked out by Heraclitus.
Yes.
Did you touch on that?
No, because
okay.
because we've had a whole lecture on
I think
it.
I think it was Aristotle that actually said that about Plato.
Yeah.
And so Heraclitus, an earlier philosopher, contended that there are no stable entities, there are no stable truths, because everything is in flux. Everything is forever changing. Nothing is fixed.
That's right.
And so that's a very difficult thing to hang an epistemology on.
Right.
And also an ontology, meaning what you can know and meaning what you can discern of what is.
Right.
Because if what is always mutating.
It's always perishable. Everything's nothing's
then
ever the same.
to what do you attach concepts?
Right.
The concepts themselves become very fluxy, which is sort of like in our modern world, which is called the postmodern world. You know what current philosophy now has accepted. But in Plato's time, that was kind of more difficult to contend with. And so it sounds to me that what Plato is doing is trying to kind of invent a kind of a foundationalism. Foundationalism meaning that you can use something as the ultimate referent for truth.
Yeah.
And so the good is that on which all these other grand truths or paradigms or whatever hang on. And so, he was kind of trying to respond to this earlier problem by coming up with, perhaps a more kind of an extreme reaction in the opposite direction.
Yeah, I mean, that's so important. So yeah, everybody, when you do any kind of like a zero in on anybody, you find out that almost never does anybody just come up with things ex nihilo, and those are just like completely are based on nothing that ever came before them, but rather almost everything is directly within its immediate context. And so Plato is having to, and Socrates are having to respond to these big philosophical conundrums that, like you say, Heraclitus and Parmenides on the opposite side have gotten people into these kind of fixes, which are: is there in fact nothing that has any kind of eternal stability? Is it all just in flux and change? And so these kind of ideas that we maybe struggle with right now, is there anything, when you talk about you and you think you're you or something, what does that even mean if from second to second to second, is it possibly that there's no actual continuity of anything, and we just are giving ourselves our delusion that there's something we think of as self? And then contrasting this, the other side, Parmenides, this idea that in fact change itself is an illusion, and that the whole universe is essentially one thing that is not in any kind of flux, but is entirely internal and eternal, and then all of the things that we kind of perceive are coming into being are not, in fact, is just essentially illusionary on that side. And so for Plato, I'm sure he's kind of drawn to that a little bit from Parmenides, because he would like to have things be more eternal, as opposed to, because he's kind of opposed to these material things that are not going to last. Nevertheless, like you say, the attempt here is to create a synthesis between these two, where we can reasonably understand the impermeability, the mortality of our bodies and everything like that, and yet try to hang on to some kind of a sense that there is an eternal good.
Yeah.
Yes, Kavanch. Yeah. Oh, did you already put the microphone away? So, no, we'll take a couple more and then it'll be the end. So.
Well, at the very end, when I think about this republic, the fundamental question to me is the republic for who? So you mentioned about the utopic character of republic.
Yeah.
And it is, to me, it is a little bit questionable.
Yeah.
Because, so when you consider republic with the cave analogy, so these eliminated or subject to elimination, very few people who are the philosophers are going to rule the state.
Yes.
And right in the middle of this attack of the first guy, justice is for the government.
Right. And so here he's created a governing class.
So
that is
the elimination. The elimination. So if it is the good is promoted.
Yeah.
For the whole cave population.
Yeah.
And then what is the dynamics here after the static kind of republic, which is very much detailed, prescribed? How come these guardian or the producer classes are going to be eliminated? So, is there a response in republic?
I think there is in some cases by the analogies. I think that's a really strong, going back to the sophist. He would, if he'd stuck around through the whole dialogue, he could have made that case. Hey, you just you dissed my original definition of justice in a society, and yet you've made a society where, frankly, it seems like the only people that are, it's essentially the power is being exercised by this philosopher class, who seems to be, having it all, having it good, and everybody else is more or less working toward that end, and they're therefore it's again in the power. And I would suggest that maybe that Plato's argument there with the ship of state is that everybody on the boat is better off. If the pilot's running the boat in an effect, in this effective way, even if the other people, even if the other sailors aren't ever able to have the knowledge of all the shoals and everything about what piloting is, and in fact, he argues a bunch of different places where that the philosophers, you may think that the philosophers here are living it up or something like that. In fact, they don't actually want to have this job. If they're good philosophers, they're only going to come into this thing reluctantly because they know it's actually pretty awful, to have to do this, but they're sacrificing on behalf of this society to make the whole society run properly. But whether or not you buy that, because of as when we think, I think of much more of an egalitarian society where every person maybe has, a lot more potential than Plato's giving them credit for.
Whether I buy it or not, but just the Plato's idea.
We have to have
whether I buy it or not, but Plato's final idea that some in the ship are left to the unenlightened situation by nature, by the nature of the world. So this is how it is, even if they are better off.
Yeah, they're better off living at their level.
The nature of utopic character of this republic is questionable in this.
It's hierarchical at the minimum. Because, at the end of the day, Plato and Aristotle have not gotten rid of hierarchy at the end of the day here. Okay, and so Elizabeth, and we'll end. Last word.
I'm thinking of two things. One is a statue. It's not very far away. It's outside Osgood Hall, and it says equal justice under law. And it's a balance like a scale, and on one side is a lion, on the other side is a lamb.
Yeah.
And it's
balance.
Level.
Yeah.
And the other is, I seem to recollect Richard Nixon comparing himself to the conductor of an orchestra, and how the players in the orchestra, they have no business arguing with him because he's got the full score and he knows the whole piece of music. And all they have is their individual parts.
Right.
Well, if you know anything about orchestras, there's lots of people in that, or firstly, anybody who wants to get a hold of the full score and study it can.
Yeah.
And secondly, a lot of the people in the orchestra think they are much better, at least as good as, and maybe better musicians than the conductor, and sometimes they are right.
Yeah. And I guess I'd say that having listened to a whole bunch of the Nixon's tapes that he more or less recorded when he didn't think anybody was listening to him or whatever, this ring of Gyges business of having an invisible ring, when you actually then can listen to him, I don't know that he's a philosopher king. So, all right, thank you everybody. We can continue to have the discussion over snacks and things like that, and we thank everybody who's joined us online. Hopefully you've enjoyed our little discussion. Thanks.